Good morning. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Flexible Ramping Product Refinement Impacts to Western Energy and Balance Market Resource Efficiency Evaluation meeting. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the California ISO, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. And I'm also joined by Daniel Johnson, Lead Policy Developer. This presentation and other materials related can be found on the Flexible Ramping Product Refinements Initiative webpage. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep comments professional and respectful. Also, please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so we can manage the time efficiently. Next slide, please. Instructions for questions. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first. You may also send your question via chat to all panelists. If you need technical assistance during today's meeting, please feel free to send a chat to the event producer. And from here, I will now turn the meeting over to Danny Johnson.
Thanks, Ellie. Can we go to the next slide? So before we get into the interaction with the FRP refinements policy in the RSC, I wanted to take a minute and kind of review what the FRP refinements policy does. As you can see from the title up there, it was passed by the CAISO board and the EIM governing body in October 2020, so it's been a little while since this may have been on everybody's mind. We are looking to implement it this fall, though, so that's why it should be rising to people's minds again. The major change on this policy was to procure FRP on a nodal basis to ensure deliverability. This is different than the existing policy, which does not have nodal deliverability. The fact that FRP is procured based on trying to minimize opportunity costs that are being withheld resulted in a lot of the FRP up awards being awarded to resources behind transmission constraints. To the extent that happened, this product was then not terribly useful as that FRP up was not deliverable. This policy aims to rectify that through ensuring nodal deliverability. The next big change was to develop a new methodology to calculate net load uncertainty. This is a mosaic quantile regression. We at the ISO have referred to this as the quantile regression in a lot of different venues. It looks at the demand, wind, and solar forecast and the drivers of the uncertainty native to each of those different elements and tries to more accurately predict the uncertainty going forward. The next thing isn't necessarily a change. FRP is still proposed to be procured on a demand curve that would be based upon the expected cost of foregoing procurement, i.e. would foregoing that procurement cost power balance and feasibility. I think the change here is that we would assign the surplus variable to the major laps within each BAA as part of our nodal procurement. The final set of changes deal with how the FRP requirement is actually calculated and allocated. Right now, under the existing methodology, each BAA gets their own FRP requirement. They are then able to utilize the import and export transfer capability that they make available to the EIM to get credits for their locational requirement. This then results in that requirement just getting rolled up into a system requirement that can be met from anywhere within the system. This paradigm is changing with the FRP refinements policy. The policy will look to utilize the results of the WEIM to calculate a requirement for the past group. This requirement would be reflective of the diversity benefit of the past group, and the nodal procurement would then occur within that past group. For any failed BAA, they would be isolated from the past group. They would have their dynamic EIM transfers zeroed out. They wouldn't receive any existing credit, and they would be responsible for meeting their own demand and a full FRP requirement absent any diversity benefit from within their own BAA. I see we have a question.
Hey, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Really just digesting this for the first time, just with the slides coming out relatively recently. So I'm just hoping you can provide a few more kind of background examples on this. So with what you just covered as far as the impact for transfer quantities, are you basically saying that the EIM BAs will no longer have their import and export transfer volumes counted as part of their available supply for meeting their resource sufficiency requirement?
Not
Or I'm sorry
quite, Dan. That supply wouldn't count regardless because we don't count the WEIM transfers. The change is that following the failure of the RSC, right now the transfers are limited to either the base net transfer or the transfers in the last past 15-minute interval. Under this new design, the transfers would be limited to the greater of 0 or the net base transfer. So the ability to access and continue to receive dynamic transfers to the extent that they're above the base transfer is changing as part of this policy. And we have a couple slides later in the presentation that explain kind of why that change is part of the design, but then also walk through the impacts of that change.
Okay. I thought that there was an impact of the availability of transfers when it came to setting the FRP requirement. Not that they're necessarily counting it as supply. I maybe put that wrong, but just that the availability of the transfers impacted it.
Yeah, I think you might be referring to the credit that you would get under the assumption that you wouldn't. Right? Your export transfers, essentially, you could recall them and use them for yourself in future EIM intervals.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if some of that's going to get discussed a little bit later, that's fine. When it comes to the nodal deliverability test on this, is that going to be applied the same way in the EIM BAs as inside the CAISO BA? My understanding was that you're looking at the uncertainty at the VERS nodes and then doing the deliverability based on a resource's ability to serve the uncertainty demand at those nodes. Is that right?
Yeah, we are testing deployment scenarios with where the awards are. Similar to kind of how the deployment scenarios would be tested in DAME for up and down imbalance reserves. It's a similar design for FRP, up and down.
And are you, I think there was a change around this time last year to allow VERS to provide FRP. Is that still going to be part of the availability under the FRP refinements policy that's going in?
That I would kind of turn to my other panelists and maybe George would know. I don't know offhand.
And then just the other questions, maybe this one for George as well, is just it seemed like there was still a lot of discussion going on around the quantile regression methodology, and I wasn't sure that had been settled out at this point. Is that still being worked on as far as exactly how that would be implemented or tested, or where's that kind of sitting?
Yes. Hi, this is George Angelis. This has been worked off, and we do have a set of requirements that they describe exactly how the quantile regression and it's several passes of the quantile regression that is going to be used to calculate the uncertainty requirements. So these are all described in the external BRS that has been posted. And regarding the VERS, from a software perspective, there is no limitation other than the fact that no award or schedule can be had for a VER above its forecast, above its VER forecast. So there is some flag in the master file in the registration of the resource that determines whether it's eligible for flexible ramp product, and it has to be 5-minute dispatchable, obviously. So if it is eligible, if it is registered in the master file as such, then obviously it can get Flex per app awards, but they're limited to the very forecast in the upward direction. You won't get an award higher than that.
Okay, I think that's something that we and some others had asked about in the past, just kind of the, I don't know, the logic that underlies that of meeting an uncertainty requirement with something that's the driver of the uncertainty requirement. But it's just something we had asked about having more discussion around in the past, but it didn't seem like we got there on it. But maybe that's a discussion for a different venue.
Yeah, you had some questions also on the resource efficiency evaluation. I just want to clarify that the Flexible Ramp Refinements Initiative did not make any changes to the resource efficiency evaluation. What we're talking about here is after the resource efficiency evaluation, what happens when the market application runs and how the Flexible Ramp product is procured. And there is a difference how BAAs that pass the test are handled with these BAAs that fail the test. So the whole discussion here is how the FlexParamp is procured for the BAAs that fail the test. But the test is not modified in any way in this initiative than what it is currently.
Okay, I think I worded that question wrong, but I think Danny got the gist of where I was going with it, but I'll think about it some more, and if I can clarify some more, I will. But thanks, George, appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. The other thing I'd mention before we move on is I think we are actually discussing the FRP refinements and the quantile regression at the MSC this Friday, if I recall correctly. So that may be an opportunity for more understanding of how it's being implemented. Okay, can we go to, okay, I saw Michelle disappear, so I think Carrie would be up next.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trade Forum, and I apologize for this very dumb question, but Callie Wells usually covers this. I thought we already went through a stakeholder process on this. I'm confused. Are you explaining the existing policy, or are you proposing something new here?
So I think to answer your question, this is meant as a refresher on the existing policy. There was an element of the existing policy that was stakeholdered, which would be this isolation of a failed BAA and that change. However, there is tariff language that needs to change to facilitate that design that wasn't explicitly stakeholders as part of the draft tariff language. So we wanted to highlight that and then more broadly discuss the impact on the WEIM RSE.
Say that last part again. So there was tariff language that was not stakeholdered. So then this is the stakeholder process for that. I guess I'm still a little unclear on whether there are changes here or whether you're just explaining what already exists. Or
I think we're more broadly looking for feedback on this potential design element's impact on the RSE. To the extent that we would continue to proceed forward with this existing design, we would then update the tariff language through the draft tariff stakeholder process, and you would see it reflected there. I have a slide a little bit later highlighting what would change, but I think we would still look to formally post updated language.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Danny.
Sure, Carrie.
There are no additional callers in the queue. Please proceed.
Okay, sure. Let's go to the next slide. So yeah, I think we just covered this with Carrie's comment a little bit, but the FRP design does have a significant change to the consequences of failure of the WEIM RSE. This again is due to the new methodology of how we would allocate the FRP requirement to a group that passes the WEIM RSE, as well as allocate a different requirement to a BAA who is isolated following failure of the WEIM RSE. Can we go to the next slide? This is the clause that we were referring to. It's from the tariff section 2934 N1B. As you can see in the highlighted red text, right now, part of the WEIM design allows for transfers to be frozen at the last past 15-minute interval. Practically, this is the greater of the net-based transfer or the import transfers at the last past 15-minute interval. This is the clause that would have to change to be the net-based transfer for the hour under this FRP refinements policy. I see we have a question from Michelle.
Yeah, this is Michelle from the CPUC. So I think what I'm understanding is that under the current design, if you fail the EIM, you are limited to the last, the WEIM transfers, the last feasible schedule. And you're saying that that's no longer going to be the case. And I guess I'm struggling to understand why that is.
Okay, well, I think we have a couple slides on that coming up. So hopefully that helps. And then to the extent that you still have questions, please feel free to raise your hand again.
Okay, but maybe I could try to understand, was this the intent when you started, or is this something you guys have discovered as you're working through the examples?
This is part of the design of FRP refinements.
So you guys knew it would change the WEIM, the transfer. So I'm confused. So you guys knew this? I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I think we knew this. It was publicly posted in the external BRS. It was discussed at the March 20th, 2020 stakeholder meeting. I think George walked through the formulation of the new FRP allocation. We simply realized that we hadn't explicitly covered this in the draft tariff language and that process, so we wanted to re-raise it for the stakeholder community, recognizing that RSE has been a bit of a hot topic over the last year, and then get feedback from the stakeholder community.
Okay, yeah, I think I have other questions after this. Thanks.
Yeah, Michelle, maybe I can provide a little bit of clarity here. So yes, this was the original design of the FRP Refinements Initiative, and the reason that we're bringing this up for discussion with the stakeholders is because more recent initiatives after the FRP refinements are moving in a different direction. This particular topic of how you handle a BAA that fails the test. So there is an apparent conflict on the direction that the FRP refinements initiative went compared to more recent initiatives that the direction is moving in a different direction. So that's why we're bringing it up for discussion here. Thank you. Okay,
and then I just also want to bring up the point that, you know, in the EIM resource sufficiency, we've been talking about, you know, this sort of structural issue with the CAISO failing more than other entities, right? Because the test itself includes the exports that are based on WEIM transfers that aren't included in the test itself. And so to add on this other layer of potential, you know, adverse consequences when you haven't sort of addressed the underlying issue seems problematic in my mind. Are you guys going to address that before you implement this? Because it seems really important that you would.
Let me be clear, Michelle. This is not about the resource sufficiency evaluation test per se. This test is not changing in any way in the FRP refinement. So this discussion here is what happens after the test. So
no, I understand it. Yeah, I get that. I guess what you're saying though is that as the result of the implementation, that the consequences of failure are going to be even larger. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Well, it depends how you see it, right? So, I mean, this is why we're having the discussion. We're not saying that the consequences are necessarily, you know, worse or bigger, or we're just saying they're different. People have different views on this. Like as Dan is going to show you other slides here to get deeper a little bit on the issue, there is a notion that if you allow a BAA that failed the test to still have dynamic transfers above, let's say, above their net base transfer, the optimization through the multi-interval look-ahead can actually drive those transfers in the previous interval at a high level so that it can accommodate the potential failure of that BAA for the next interval. So essentially, it actually waters down the ability to limit a BAA leaning on the rest of the market footprint. So there are different views of this. So
yeah, so I guess the way I'm seeing this, though, is that it looks like it's going to have consequences to limit you not to the last available transfer, but limit you to 0 if you fail. So it seems to my perspective that the consequences are larger. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. But I also want to go back to the earlier point that CAISO systematically fails or is disadvantaged because when we do the RSE test itself, it includes the exports that are based on the WEIM transfers that are not included in the test. And I thought we really needed to get to the root of that problem before we add on these other layers of, I mean, this seems like a huge reliability issue from my perspective. And it seems like one we need to address holistically and not in these individual parts. So I guess that's my comments, but thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I understand your concern, and to your point on that WEIM HASP export issue, that is part of the scope of the RSEE Phase 2. We plan to get a straw proposal out in June on that, trying to rectify that issue. So to the extent that you think that that would exacerbate the FRP design, I think that's the type of feedback we would be looking for in comments.
Okay, but I would note that if this goes into effect in the fall, which is before you have the changes, so like let's say you came up with a straw proposal, when do you think the earliest you can address it to address that issue that I'm talking about?
Our outline would call for that to try to be resolved by the end of the year through the policy development process.
Right, but then implementation. So like, for example, to me, it seems absolutely critical that whatever proposal you put in would be implemented before next summer when this FRP design potentially goes into effect. I mean, if you implement in the fall and it's going to be in the summer, I'm seeing huge reliability issues.
Yeah, I understand why you would have that concern. And again, I think that's the type of feedback we're trying to solicit with this workshop.
Okay, thank you.
There are no additional callers in the queue. Please proceed.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is a slightly modified version of the formulation that was presented in the revised straw proposal call on March 20th. The box that is outlined in red on the right is the formulation for the allocation of the FRU and FRD requirements for the past group. I have simply added a legend on the left that would allow anybody who's interested in reviewing this formulation to be able to do so without having to go and reopen the technical appendix for FRP. Can we go to the next slide? So George kind of touched on this earlier about why the isolation and the limitation on dynamic transfers is an important part of this existing design. And really it gets to what the multi-interval optimization does. So when a BAA fails the RSE, if it is not isolated and its transfers are not limited, the WEIM optimal solution would actually look to increase dynamic transfers prior to the failure in an attempt to minimize the solution costs during the failed interval. In layman's terms, the market will try to ramp up EIM transfers to a higher level such that when the BAA fails, the power balance constraint relaxation is minimized so that it tries to constrain the net transfer at a higher level. The other thing that this design element does is it allows, or it aligns the cost allocation for the design with the FRP procurement to the extent that a BAA is isolated and can't receive dynamic transfers. The resources of the past group aren't re-optimized and repositioned to meet the FRP requirement in the isolated BAA. The other thing that it does is the isolated BAA's requirement would likely be higher as it has no diversity benefit. Allowing dynamic transfers in would effectively allow the past group to serve the isolated BAA, but the entire footprint's FRP requirement would actually be higher since that BAA doesn't have any diversity benefit. Can we go to the next slide? So the settlement of this is a fairly important element. So I wanted to turn it over to James Lynn to try to walk through in a little bit more detail the settlement and why that isolation is important for the proposed settlement.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to do just basically 2 slides covering on a very high level, how the proposed FRB refinements is going to impact the overall settlement of forecasted movement and uncertainty. And where its main impact is going to be on is who is responsible for paying for those costs. So for forecasted movement, the resources generation, imports and exports that have forecasted movement, they're going to settle in the same manner as it does today. It's going to be the forecasted movement megawatts times the difference between the flexible ramp up price and the flexible ramp down price. However, where the intricacy comes in is now how do I allocate this forecasted move cost? Well, if the BAA passes both of the flexible ramp up test as well as the flexible ramp down test, then it's considered part of the pass group, and then its forecast movement costs are embedded within or summed up against all the other BAAs that also passed the resource efficiency test, and then allocated to meter demand of the BAAs that have passed the resource efficiency test. If it fails, let's say it fails both, then the forecasted movement cost is isolated strictly to that BAA. So all the forecast movement cost for that BAA is going to be allocated to meter demand within that BAA. If, for example, it passes one and fails the other, this is where it gets a little more complicated, because as I calculated the forecasted movement settlement, let's say they pass the up and fail the down. I will take the forecasted movement settlement at the up price and allocate it to the meter demand within the BAs that pass, but now the forecasted movement down costs, which are strictly going to be isolated to that BA, is going to be allocated to the meter demand within that BAA. So there is a big change is what today. Today, the forecasted movement is pro rata allocation across the entire EIM area meter demand. So now when we go to uncertainty, which is the next slide, a similar concept applies. If you have received an uncertainty award, your generator or your resource will get paid for that uncertainty reward award, regardless of it's up or down. But then it goes back into the same similar concepts when it comes to the allocation. If you are part of the pass group, we will calculate a pass group uncertainty category requirements, and then the cost will be allocated to those requirements along with all the other past BAAs, flexible ramp up costs or down costs. And then it's to be allocated pro rata to those buckets, the resources within the buckets for the pass group. If you fail, again, it's going to be like I discussed with the forecasted movement, and you're going to be isolated to your BAA. So if you fail, those flexible ramp uncertainty costs are going to be isolated to the categories of that BAA and then to the resources of that BAA. We're not going to have that sharing effect. It will happen if they had passed the resource efficiency test. If you have any questions on this, I'm happy to answer.
There are no callers in the queue. Please proceed.
Okay, so Danny, I'm going to pass it back to you, so please go next slide.
Yep, thank you, James. So I think this next slide really gets at why we're having this workshop. So currently, following the failure of the WEIM RSE, transfers are limited to the greater of the base transfer or the transfer in the last past 15-minute interval. One of the advantages of this design is that it ensures that following a failure of the RSE, the failed BAA does not experience a reliability issue through an additional reduction in transfers. I think the fact that the EIM can access those resources means they are out there. The reliability issue is created by moving those transactions out of the EIM, which is optimally determined, into the emergency energy assistance paradigm, likely during tight system conditions where the BAA is already trying to secure emergency energy assistance to meet their obligations in the upcoming hour. As Michelle mentioned earlier, there is also an interplay with the HASP RSE design, which allows WEIM advisory transfers to support hourly exports. Constraining transfers at levels above zero, as is currently done today, does somewhat mitigate the reliability and pricing impacts of that design. In addition, through the RSEE Phase 1 policy initiative, we heard a lot of desire from the stakeholder community to try to move the WEIM in a direction that would allow it to be leveraged in emergency conditions to provide energy assistance at penalty type prices. This was discussed this spring through a couple workshops and is now included in the Phase 2 scope, which we're going to be getting underway next month. This FRP design, it is counter to that stated desire from the stakeholder community. The Phase 2 is actually looking to enable further transfers with severe financial consequences in lieu of any BAA isolation. So again, we just want to highlight that these two things are in some level of contradiction. So I do see Michelle is back in the queue.
Hey, yeah, so this is exactly what I was talking about. So I think I finally put it together. But I guess I mean, these are the kinds of comments, but if you plan to put this in effect in the fall, it does seem like the reliability and pricing impacts will be there if you don't correct that underlying issue. So if, for example, 1,000 megawatts of WEIM transfers allows for 1,000 megawatts of exports, but then the CAISO fails the RSE, maybe for this reason alone, and loses access to the WEIM transfers that supported those exports, then that is going to send CAISO into a reliability issue if they have to continue to support those exports and they don't have the imports. I mean, again, CAISO is an import-dependent state, so to the extent that we're exporting, we're typically relying on those imports. So if they don't show up, then I'm just wondering who is going to support those exports. I mean, are we going to, yeah. And I mean, this is after the HASP, and we don't cut exports after the HASP typically. So I'm really struggling to understand how this is going to work.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that's the contradiction that we're trying to solicit feedback on. And if the FRP design would need to change or should proceed as designed is the type of feedback we're looking for.
Okay, I guess I'm not so familiar with the FRP, so I don't know exactly what I can say to do it other than don't do it until you figure out how to address this sort of underlying reliability issue. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Sure.
We do have one additional caller in the queue.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley. Oh, yeah, thanks. Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Okay, I found this presentation a little confusing, but I think I finally understand what's going on. So if I could tell you, and then if you could tell me if I'm right or wrong, that would be really helpful. Okay, so pre-2020, we have this new policy that we stakeholdered, but we didn't really think about edge cases because it was pre-2020. And then 2020 happened, and so you had staffing issues at the CAISO, and so this was never filed at FERC. So now we have a policy that the tariff was never fully developed and filed at FERC. And so now we're coming back to this, and now we really care about edge cases because we know there's scarcity across the West. So what you're telling us here is, hey, let's reevaluate this whole initiative. And for the reasons Michelle said, you're soliciting feedback, and then you're going to come back with a new design. Do I have it?
I don't know if I can agree with the totality of that statement. Yeah, this was approved in fall of 2020. I think there was a number of reasons why it is being proposed for implementation fall of 2022. but I think to the extent that the edge cases specifically relating to the failure of the RSE and what happens and what a BAA's options are to procure emergency energy assistance, that is much more prevalent following the events of 2020. So yeah, this does contradict, or this design does present potentially an issue with how BAAs who fail the RSE are able to access emergency energy assistance and how much emergency energy they have to procure.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to hear at least some general stakeholder pushback to keep going with fall of 2022. And so I hope that the next step is a new straw proposal or updated draft final or whatever mechanically you want to do. And then I don't think we need to implement this in fall of 2022, or is that the target still?
I think to the extent that we have stakeholder support to implement it in the fall of 2022, that is still the direction that we would look to go. But until we kind of know where the stakeholder community is on this design, I don't think we can comment on what the implementation, on any changes to the implementation timeline.
I guess I'm really confused about this sudden deference to stakeholders. Like, I think there's a clear reliability issue that you've articulated. So I guess what I'm asking is, can you resolve the reliability issue you articulated by fall of 2022 or not? Because I don't know how to comment. Like, I'm fine with fall of 2022 if there's no reliability issues, but I don't know how you solve it, and I don't have any ideas on that. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
There are paths forward to solve it. I think it starts to change how the costs for FRP procurement are allocated. So that could be the trade-off. To the extent that we want to implement this in fall of 2022, it might be a slightly different settlement following enabling those dynamic transfers and keeping the current consequences for failure of the RSE.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I think this all makes sense now, and we will comment along those lines. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you, operator.
I see Bonnie next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So maybe I'm losing track of kind of what's in place and what's proposed, but my recollection is that you, I think it's already in place, is limitations on procuring flexible ramping product at a minimum within BAAs where the BAA is represents a high or I forget what the terminology was, but basically, I mean, mostly it applies to the CAISO BAA where you target procurement of a minimum quantity of FRP within the BAA. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, that was an element of the FRP refinements. I viewed that more as almost a placeholder to make the existing design work better while the nodal deliverability was implemented.
All right, so that will go away. That minimum internal procurement requirement will go away before this change would be implemented. Is that correct?
I would defer to George. I'm not quite sure.
I'm sorry, Bonnie. What is the element that you think it's going away?
The requirement that you procure a certain amount of FRP within a BAA if that BAA basically represents a high percentage of overall FRP requirements. And you know, my understanding is that it typically and maybe exclusively applies to the KISO BAA. Does that?
Oh, no. No, I think you're referring to the procurement of the flexible ramp product for the BAA or the BAAs that failed the test. I mean, this is the whole. That's we're having the discussion here. It's about this particular topic, right? So
No, wait.
Okay.
I thought there was a rule in place, and maybe it goes away when you implement nodal procurement. That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. I thought there's currently a requirement in place, and it doesn't have to do with whether you pass or fail the RSE. I thought it was independent of the RSE, that if a BAA represents a certain percentage of or gives rise to a certain percentage of overall FRP requirements, then you have a rule that you will procure X percentage of FRP from within that BAA. Am I right about that?
Sure. Yeah, this is the current rule that affects, so to speak, large BAAs. There is a limit, all right, on the low end that says you must have at least a certain amount of uncertainty requirement. It won't be possible to annihilate that with all the diversity benefit and the room that you have on transfers. That's what you're referring to, right?
Right. Now, so the first question is, when you implement nodal FRP procurement, does that rule go away?
Yes, we have a completely new methodology under the FRP refinements for calculating uncertainty requirements that doesn't need these safeguards, because we're using a more accurate way to calculate uncertainty, taking into account not only historical data, but also the current forecast for the three regressors, demand forecast, solar forecast, and wind forecast, and we're harvesting this data and we apply quantile regression. So it's a different approach than the histogram approach today that needs these safeguards. We still have in the software, limits that we can tune if there is a need for that. But we believe that this new methodology will provide good results. But of course, we have to see. But we do have the safeguards if we need to apply them.
Okay,
it's a different methodology.
All right. So follow-up question. Assume a scenario where the KISO fails. Is it failure of either the capacity test or the flexibility RSE test that would lead to
That's correct.
Zero transfers? Okay. So suppose...
That's correct. We are not changing the RSE mechanism through the FRP refinement. It stays the same as today.
Okay. So assume a situation where the KISO BAA fails the RSE, either for capacity or flexibility. Does that mean that there would be, would that prevent transfers out of flexibility to other BAAs? In other words, if the KISO is it isolated both for imports and exports, or only for imports?
No, the constraint on the net energy transfer is applied in the direction that you fail the test. So if you fail the upward test, then net import transfers are constrained. You can still export, right? If you fail in the downward direction, it's the net export that is constrained. You can still import. So it's limited in the direction that you fail the test.
Okay, so then another question. Does that mean that there could be a situation where the KISO is still supporting other BAAs through exports, but precluded from getting any support from other BAAs through imports?
Yes. So the FRP refinements design, if you fail the upward test, then your net import transfer is limited to 0 because we don't have base transfers for the ISO, but you can still export. So you can still export energy if it's economic to export and you have the available capacity to. So you can help other BAAs, but because we fail the upward test, other BAs won't help us if we need capacity for mitigating upward uncertainty.
That doesn't sound right to me, but I'll think about it. I mean, it doesn't sound fair to me or reasonable, but I will think about it.
Let me explain. Let me explain. So the fact that you failed the test, okay, means that you don't have sufficient capacity, all right, to meet the 97.5 percentile of uncertainty if it materializes. Okay.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that that uncertainty will materialize. So if it doesn't materialize at that level, okay, and you still have available capacity in the BAA, which is economic to dispatch, that could be dispatched and could result in a net export. There's no problem with that, right? The issue is if the level of uncertainty that materializes exhausts all your capacity that you had available, because you failed the test, and the purpose of the test is to prevent a BAA from leaning on other BAAs, that constraint prevents you from importing energy to meet your uncertainty requirement, because you're supposed to meet the uncertainty requirement from your own resources at that point. So it really depends on how the situation materializes in real time.
Right, but it sounds to me as if reducing the imports to 0, but continuing to allow exports, especially for, the largest BAA in the overall market footprint. It's going to allow other BAAs to suck capacity out of the CAISO for flexibility purposes.
So these exports are economic, right? We're not talking about self-schedule here. The export transfers are economic. So if the economics allow for that export, then of course you want it to flow. That's the result of the market. Now, if the ISO, speaking for the ISO specifically, is running out of available capacity, all right, and the price is high at the ISO, obviously those exports are not going to be scheduled because they're not economic. You're not going to drop load at the ISO to serve some economic export. It's not going to happen. The exports are going to be 0. So only if there is available capacity and it's economic, then the export can be scheduled. So it's an economic export. So it's no harm. It doesn't harm the ISO. If we need the capacity to serve our own load, those exports are going to be scheduled to 0. They're dynamic, right? There's not going to be any export. However, we allow the market, if there is available capacity and it's economic, why not export it? That's the purpose of the market.
This is Danny. I just want to clarify. We're talking about the WEIM transfer exports. Right, George?
Correct. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, the dynamic economic transfers in the WEIM, yeah.
Okay.
And I guess one thing I would want some maybe additional detail about is, is sort of what is the relative timing? I mean, is FRP is FRP reoptimized every 5 minutes along with energy?
This is a very important question. The timing is very important. So as you know, the test is performed 3 times in each hour, right? T-minus 75, T-minus 55, and T-minus 40.
Right.
To T-minus 30, but anyway, 3 times within the hour. And then after the test is performed, then we run the market. We run the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market, and we run several of those before the next RSC is performed, right? So, and these real-time market applications, they have a time horizon, right? So you can see ahead of time what is happening. So if we fail the test, let's say in some future interval, the test is performed for every 15-minute interval of each hour, right? So let's say there is a test failure in the third interval of the hour, okay? And the market is running. The market will see that there is a constraint imposed limiting, let's say, the import transfers for that third interval, all right? So it will try to schedule economically, of course, resources in the first two intervals to ramp up to cover the deficiency that otherwise would occur in that third interval. If that can be prevented by the market will take an action. Now, what we are particularly concerned here is what if there is not enough time for the market to react, right? So let's say we fail the first 15-minute interval. Well, now that there is not much time for the market to react, so having a transfer to roll back to zero, the import transfer to roll back to zero, it's really immediate for the time horizon. So there is a concern that we have enough ramp capability to recover that. So timing is important, and depending on when the failure occurs, whether there is sufficient time for the market to react and ramp resources or not, it's an issue that we have a concern, and that's why we're bringing all this thing here for discussion.
Okay. Yeah, that I guess that helps. I do have a concern about the timing and kind of the asymmetry between freezing imports while continuing to allow exports, given the relative size of the CAISO relative to the overall.
That asymmetry. Yeah, that asymmetry is because of the RSC result asymmetry, right? We only limit the transfers in the direction of the RSC failure, right? If you fail both the upward and downward tests, both imports and export transfers are limited to zero. But if you fail the test only in one direction, then we only limit the transfer in that direction because you only lean potentially in that direction. In the other direction, you're not leaning, you're passing the test. So why not participating in the market as normal? So we don't limit the transfers in that other direction. So that actually makes sense, right? You only restrict it from full participation in the market in the direction that you failed the test, right? That it was always like that.
Right, but it was not always the case that you reduced transfers in the direction you failed to zero. I mean, it's a big change, right? It's a big change from reducing it to the to the level of the last interval where you passed down to zero, or it's potentially a big change, or it's going to be a big change in some intervals. I think I would, and I would be particularly troubled if, because of timing issues, the CAISO could be in the position of continuing to support the rest of the footprint while, because of continuing exports, while not, while being cut off from getting any support from the rest of the footprint, because of that directionality point. I mean, I see the logic. But I'm not sure that I would be confident that the outcomes would be reasonable. But I'll think.
Right. So, and this is why we're bringing it here, because the time the FRP refinements initiative was, stakeholder, at that time, there was still a very strong notion that we wanted BAAs that failed the test to have a limitation in their transfers. I mean, that was the whole idea. We don't want these BAAs to lean on the rest of the market footprint. And that's why you have all these rules. Okay, we have to limit the transfer at the beginning because limiting at the less restrictive of the net base transfer or the T minus 7.5, the transfer before the beginning of the hour, then it became the transfer in the previous 15-minute interval. With FRP refinements, there's a very clear separation and distinction between the BAs that fail and the BAs that pass, so that went to the base transfer. But recent initiatives, newer initiatives, they're moving in a different direction. As you know, in EDAM, we're proposing not to limit the transfers, and that may also happen in WEIM. So there is a change in the direction of the policy that now says, maybe we should allow BAAs that fail the test to have some participation in the market. I mean, that's why we have the market after all. We have benefits. Let's make use of them. But maybe there are some financial consequences. So that change in the overall policy is in direct conflict with previous policy of limiting the transfers, and that previous policy is reflected in the FRP refinements. So if we're going to move in a different direction, maybe that particular aspect of the FRP refinement policy and implementation needs to change. And that's why we're bringing it here for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of which way the policy is trending, in a way, it almost seems like, we're kind of on a roller coaster here, because we're saying, you're saying, okay, the current policy is, if you fail the RSE, the transfers are limited in the direction of the failure to the level of the most recent interval where you passed. Right? So, am I right so far?
Yes, that's the current.
Yeah.
The current
okay.
implementation.
And then this proposal, this suggestion, would go from the level that was in place in the most recent interval where you passed down to 0. But then the EDAM proposal is not to limit transfers at all as a result of RSE failure. So, I mean, it just seems to me like it's kind of a crazy shifting, from one extreme to another in a relatively short space, versus either staying with what we've had in place for a while or until something is adopted for EDAM, whatever that turns out to be. But to kind of to go in opposite directions for something you want to limit, you want to implement in 2022 from where it looks like you're heading in 2024, that also is troubling to me.
Yeah, Bonnie, this is Danny with the ISO. I think we agree with your concern, and that's why we're here today. This policy was from back in 2020. The RSE initiative that occurred in the interim and the EDAM initiative that is going on right now were after this. So we do recognize that conflict, and that's why we're trying to see if stakeholders still want to move in this direction on the FRP design. I had a second comment on your concern with the asymmetry of the CAISO BAA exporting. I think that we may be able to somewhat allay that concern. There's a constraint in the market that does not allow for EIM exports if there is either a PBC relaxation or the exorcism of ABC. So to the extent that prices rising in the CAISO as the CAISO BAA would go scarce in trying to meet its requirement, doesn't create enough price separation between neighboring BAAs, the export EIM transfers would naturally be limited by that constraint prior to the CAISO's PBC being relaxed. So hopefully that helps on that concern.
That helps. Yeah, that helps. Okay. I appreciate the responses. I'll just, so maybe one more question before I just, give away the microphone to somebody else. So is there a reason other than, I'm having trouble phrasing the question. So the current policy is if you fail the RSE in a particular direction, hold on while I mute my other phone. If you fail the RSE in either direction, you're limited to transfer levels at the interval where you previously passed. Is there a reason other than wanting to enhance the or to further limit leaning? Is there any reason other than that for going from the previously passed interval down to zero, other than to further discourage or further reduce potential leaning?
Yeah, I think there is, Bonnie, and it gets to how the settlement is performed and making sure the settlement is designed with where the FRP is being procured and for which requirement it is being procured to meet. To the extent that you allow the dynamic transfers at the last EIM interval, then you could have resources in the broader pass footprint being optimally used to try to meet the increased FRP target in the isolated BAA.
Okay. Okay, I get that. Would there be any other way to be any other way to address sort of the cost allocation concern other than reducing allowed transfers to zero? I mean, could you modify the settlements part to shift or to increase the costs to the BAA that fails rather than reducing allowed transfers to zero?
Well, I think anything is possible, Bonnie. I would defer to James Lynn on if that type of settlement would be feasible.
Well, I think what we need, this is James, sorry, I think what we would need to do is determine how to make that determination on the cost shift if we were going to go down that route. There are other options which are available that we are going to discuss depending upon what the stakeholders decide regarding this. If stakeholders decide that we want to stay with the last 15-minute pass, then we have to look at options. I don't have a specific option in mind, but yes, we will have to look at options.
There may be options to address, maybe what might be considered a cost implication, other than,
Cool.
that. Okay, cool. All right.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Thanks for letting me ask so many questions.
Thank you. We do
Thanks,
have additional callers in the queue. Next caller in the queue.
Hey, Danny, Dan from Customized Energy Solutions again. So just processing all of that back and forth with Bonnie there was good. I think we got to a point of kind of getting some of this in plain language, but my request here really is that you put out a comment deadline on this for the 20th. The slides just came out this morning, so we're all just kind of looking at this and trying to think through it and think through the implications. And I know everybody's busy at the CAISO. There's a lot going on, but we really need like a 3 to 5 page, some form of a plain English description of what's being proposed here, what the issues are that are in play, and a few examples in order to be able to look at it and comment on it with all the information. I think you and George have described some good things here. James has as well, but it's just a lot to think through. And honestly, the slides are just too much in shorthand to really make sense of all of it. So I would really appreciate if you could kind of both do that and depending on how long that takes to pull together, think about extending out the comment deadline to give people time to think through this some more. It may also be good to get past the 2-day EDAM meeting if possible, so that we would have the benefit of having talked through some of the RSC proposal that you're putting in EDAM, which I was a little bit surprised to see the proposal in there around the emergency energy assistance at the offer cap put into the EDAM straw proposal when I didn't think that had been settled in a RSC meeting at this point. So, it may just be good to kind of talk through that either in an RSC meeting that I expect is coming up on that, or at least in the EDAM 2-day meeting before then commenting and deciding where to go on this specific issue. Because I take what a big part of this is that if there is an emergency assistance program that's drawing in assistance to a BA that's failed and that's trying to procure additional FRP within its area, and that assistance is coming in at a high price, then you want to make sure that you're allocating that out appropriately to the drivers for the uncertainty within that BA. But it just seems like there's a lot of kind of contingent steps that we're going along here, and it seems premature to decide something on this without having had those discussions in the on the EIM RSC side around that emergency assistance program. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think we'll take that back and see what we're able to do. I don't think I can commit to putting out a paper on this in the near term, although, again, we'll see what we can do. To the extent that stakeholders want more time to comment on this, I think we can add time to the comment period.
I mean, even,
and then,
I'm not asking for a full-blown white paper, but even just listening to this recording and the questions that have been asked and then writing something out that captures that would be really helpful. It's just looking, Carrie, Bonnie, myself, Michelle, we're all in these meetings all the time. And if it's confusing us, it's probably confusing a lot of other people as well.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And then regarding the EDAM comments, I look forward to having that discussion later this month at the stakeholder meeting.
Thank you. We do have additional callers in the queue. Next caller in the queue. Your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Michelle Keto from the CPC. I just wanted to make clear that when you guys were answering Bonnie's question, you guys were talking about exports, WEIM transfers, exporting, right? Which would be economic and you could cut them rather than cut load. But I just wanted to clarify that when I was talking about exports, I was talking about HASP exports that you don't cut, right, after the HASP process. And that those HASP exports are premised on the WEIM advisory transfers, right? So those WEIM transfers, if RSC failure, it loses access to the WEIM advisory transfers that supported the HASP exports. And you don't cut the HASP exports, right? Because they're not economic at that point. They're scheduled. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify because you guys were answering that all in terms of the WEIM export, and in my mind, the real problem is the HASP exports, right?
Well, I think they both could cause issues, but as you can see from the slide that's up, we have the bullet recognizing that the HASP-enabled exports are something that we think could be an issue with this existing design.
Okay. It's just you answered it to Bonnie in the terms of, and I know you clarified that, but I just wanted to make it clear that, the HASP exports don't cut just, for economic reasons, just the WEIM transfer exports. That's all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Next caller in the queue, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum again. I was trying to get a grasp on what's severable and what's not in this policy. And maybe this could be answered in the paper that Dan suggested. I think that's a great suggestion, and I hope you do it. But I'm wondering if you could just answer maybe briefly now. The main pieces are you have the FRP on a nodal basis, you have the quantile regression, and then you have the demand curve. And could you implement those separately from maintaining the 15-minute pass and the new cost allocation, and then maybe even addressing the HASP export issues? Does my question make sense? Like, can we implement some of it in part in fall 2022, or is it an all or nothing deal?
George, I would defer to you
yes.
on the implementation.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. This is George Angelis with the So yes, Carrie, these elements are fundamental for the FRP refinements, and they don't have strong links with what we're discussing here, which is the constraint imposed for BAAs that failed the test in a certain direction and the associated settlement impact. So these elements that you mentioned, the new methodology for calculating uncertainty, the new methodology for procuring flexible RAM product nodally with the deployment scenarios, and I think you mentioned something else too, I don't remember now, they're all on track for implementation in this fall release. The only item that we are concerned because it's in some conflict with recent directions in what you do when a BAA fails the test, that is the item of discussion here, and we have potentially the ability to maintain the current status quo of setting the constraint to limit the net transfer in the direction of the failure of the RSC to the less restrictive between the base net transfer or the optimal transfer in the previous interval. But if we do that, then we have to make some changes in the settlement process, because once you allow dynamic transfers for a BA that failed the test, you cannot now consider it completely isolated from the other BAAs. So now you'll have to consider that BA as part of the group. Essentially, the whole market footprint becomes one group of BAAs. They all share now diversity benefit. You procure flexible RAM for all of them, as if they are one big happy family, and you allow transfers. The only difference is that the transfers for that particular BA, you still limit them to the optimal transfer of the previous interval. But then the cost allocation will be globally for the entire market footprint. So we can do all this, and this is what we want to first get a feedback from the stakeholder community that, yeah, we prefer the status quo versus where you were going with the FRP refinements design, because the design specifically for where you limit the transfers is not consistent with more recent policy that goes in a different direction. That's what we want to establish here.
Yeah, I guess, thanks, George. I think I understood what you said. So I guess I'm framing it a little differently. I think WPPF's preference is that we move forward with filing the tariff at FERC and then implementing the nodal basis, the quantile regression, and then maybe the demand curve. And that goes forward. And then the CAISO opens back up the stakeholder initiative with the premise, perhaps, that EIM does not make us less reliable, or the WEIM doesn't make us less reliable, and addresses what you have on this slide, as well as the HASP export issue. But that gets addressed globally in a separate stakeholder initiative that then goes back to the board. And because I think with what you're talking about here, no matter what, you have to go back to the board because it's going to make a significant change to the prior board approved policy. So what I'm just making sure is that you can go forth and implement at FERC with the tariff changes, those first three things that I said, and then you could do a stakeholder process with the last needs identified on this slide 11. Does my question make sense? It's a higher level. I'm not looking for details. I just want to know that we can move forward with these items separately.
Yes, we are moving forward with the FRP refinements. We may make some pivotal change here on how we handle the BAs that failed the test, but all the other aspects they're still on track.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Thanks,
Charlie. And then regarding your home for trying to unwind this, Carrie, that would be the RSCE phase 2. Like we're already kind of figuring out any FRP implications into the scope of that as well.
Okay, so it's going to move from here into the RSC phase 2.
Well, RSC phase 2 is trying to unwind that HASP RSC export concern. So then to the extent that once that's unwound, we have a different settlement than what has been previously identified as part of the FRP design to go live for fall of 2020, we would look to have additional discussion on that settlement in the RSEE phase 2 scope.
Okay, that's helpful. You know, again, seconding Dan's request for details, but then also adding process to that paper. WPTF supports transparency, and to me, this needs to go back to the board if you're changing what was board approved. It can't just keep going forward or have separate elements moved into a different initiative. So maybe you guys can think a little bit more about process and get back to us.
Will do. Thank you, Carrie.
There are no additional callers in the queue. Please proceed.
Good. Thanks, Ellie. Can we go to the next slide? So this is next steps. Obviously, with the feedback that we've heard, we would look to extend the comment period at a minimum, and then we will discuss internally what we're able to do to provide more information on this topic. So I guess look for market notices with at a minimum a revised comment date. And I turn it back over to you, Ellie. Oh, I do see one more question in the queue.
Yeah, good morning, Josh Arnold. I just wanted to support Dan in his request for a write-up on that, as well as Carrie on her comments regarding timing and process, especially regarding board approval, because I'm looking at the calendar and we're supposed to be market simming the FRP changes in about 2 months, starting in the middle of July. So at this point, I'm assuming that your vendors are already at work with what needs to be changed in order to do the nodal FRP procurement that we did stakeholder back in 2020. It just seems very poor form to come in at the last minute and try to update a stakeholder process just because of things that changed between then and now. I mean, you have to remember nodal FRP was supposed to go in last fall of 2021, but was pushed because of CAISO staffing issues. So had we gone live with it as intended, we would be having to do another initiative for this anyway. So I would really like to support Carrie's proposal on this, that let's go ahead, implement what we've already stakeholdered, what's already being worked on, and wrap this into a more holistic initiative looking at general RSC failures and edge cases where maybe we can start relaxing some of the restrictions on the failure cases, because it just seems like we're at the end of the run on this. Let's just get what we have implemented in a manageable way instead of adding on to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, Josh, and it's what we're looking to do to go forward with FRP refinements regarding this element of the design of the isolation and transfer limitations. We're simply recognizing that it is contrary to a couple recent policy initiatives and are looking for feedback on if that element of the design would need to change.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, we stakeholdered this. I know it was delayed. We've got we've only got 2 months to make any substantive changes that would need to have board approval, proper discussion, proper consideration. Given everything on the table, I would feel much more comfortable putting this into a separate, broader initiative, maybe even targeting spring of next year, if that's more feasible. as a fast fix. But just trying to get this into fall, we're past that gate.
So to make sure I'm following, you're suggesting to push fall of 2022 for all of FRP while this is resolved, or to implement what's been stakeholdered and approved as designed and then try to rectify with a follow-up initiative?
Yes, very much the latter.
The latter?
I don't think,
okay.
Given all the presentations that you guys have done, especially George's data, obviously nodal FRP is a very critical thing moving forward. I don't think we want to push it again. I think fall of 2022 is good for that. Get those changes in place because they have been stakeholdered, they have been approved. We did stakeholder tariff language changes back in March of last year. This is sort of something being slapped on at the end. Let's give it its proper consideration and proper time to think it through effectively. It just feels too rushed and too at the end.
Thanks, Josh. I think that this is the type of feedback we're trying to hold this workshop to get, because to the extent that would be your opinion and PG&E's opinion, like that's what we'd hope to see in comments. I think other entities may have different opinions given the potential reliability impacts of this change in the RSEE policy direction recently. So I think we're looking to figure out where the stakeholder community is and then proceed forward from there. But,
okay, the only thing I would say to that is, like I said, had we gone live with this last fall as expected, as stakeholdered originally, this would be a moot point. We'd be doing a separate initiative now anyway, and there'd be no way for you to get that initiative in place effectively by fall of 2022. It's not that uncommon for CAISO initiatives that between the end of the stakeholdering and the start of the implementation or the go live, that things come up and change in the policy arena, and we have to go back and fix things. That's kind of job security for those of us who do the policy. We're always trying to refine and fix. I just want us to be able to give this change proper consideration, because up to this point, no changes to the capping of transfers have actually, yes, they've been discussed, but they haven't received approval. They haven't made it through the full stakeholder process, so we don't actually have a full roadmap to get to an agreed upon opinion on that. And it just feels like this is very rushed. And I'm not even sure, even from the settlement side, I'm not even sure what the true impact would be.
I mean, to the extent that I would, I guess, push back that this hasn't been stakeholder. Like, this is in the technical appendix, this formulation. It's pretty clear in the BRS that this is the proposed direction. So I think to the extent that we would want to move forward, we can credibly say this was stakeholdered. I think the bigger question is what are the impacts of this in consideration of other initiatives that the ISO has going on, and that's the feedback that we're looking for. And I totally agree with you, Josh. FRP is important. It's something that we want to get in place. We think that it solves a existing issue in the market, and we're trying to look to get it in place as soon as possible, while also considering other initiatives that the ISO has going on.
Okay, and I would again echo Dan's request for a brief write-up with some examples, because that would help me incredibly. I'm much more of a visual person than an auditory one, so those write-ups do help considerably for those of us like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. I see Michelle jumped back in the queue.
Hey, this is Michelle from the CPUC. I know I'm going to be beating a dead horse, but I think I feel a little differently than Josh. I'm concerned that if you implement this, that when you stakeholder this, it's not that I oppose FRP in the least, but when you stakeholder this, I don't think we knew that WEIM transfers supported exports and that we had this potentially serious reliability issue, and that if you implement FRP in the way that you have right here, which is that you go to zero transfers, that we could fail the RSE, lose access to the imports that support the exports, and that will be a reliability issue. And I just cannot, in good conscience, say that that's a good idea. So I just wanted to make that point clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Other than, I guess, being referred to maybe as a dead horse, I agree with your comments, and I think that this does exacerbate that existing issue, and that's what we would be looking for in your comments. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, you're not the dead horse. I'm just sorry.
I know. Just trying to inject a little levity.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Danny, Dan again from Customized Energy Solutions. So I just agreeing a little bit with the intent of what Michelle said. I actually do really good that, CAISO identified this as a potential issue that was out of step with recent work and is bringing this forward instead of just, kind of pushing things through and then dealing with it after implementation. I think it's really good that you're doing what you're doing now that we understand it a little bit better. I think maybe just a bridge to some of PG&E's comments is to suggest that we just take a look at that market sim and the BRS, and you've probably already done this just to see if we did as you're suggesting to make some settlements changes to still use the last good value as the limitation for the transfers, could you still proceed on the a reasonable market sim timeline and hit the fall implementation? And is there time to get through a few of the kind of the processes to still hit that implementation schedule, just so that can kind of fill in some of the knowledge base for folks? Because I definitely agree. You've done a lot of work that folks have been waiting a while for on doing the nodal FRP, and should get that in, and hopefully just making a sensible alignment with recent policy directions won't have to delay that.
Thanks, Dan. And I think our objective, to the extent that we can get stakeholder support, would be to try to implement FRP, or as much of the FRP policy as we can, for fall of 2022.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley.
Okay, I see.
Oh, yep. I was unmuted. Yeah,
Hi, Carrie.
I just wanted to make sure, well, tell me if this is not a true statement, but I just wanted to make sure that Josh knew that this actually wasn't tariff approved, or wasn't FERC approved policy, right? You still have to take this to FERC. And so it couldn't have been approved, or it couldn't have been implemented last fall because you guys never filed the tariff, right?
That is correct. It is board and EM governing body approved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know Josh follows FERC closely, so he'll care about that, because if we were to take this to FERC now in totality, I actually think there would be a significant chance that FERC would reject it because of the reliability impacts that have been identified on this call. And I think maybe that was the missing piece. Otherwise, I would agree with Josh. If it was FERC approved, then yeah, let's just implement it and then fix it. That's a very normal process. But I think the key here is that this is not FERC approved policy, and as packaged originally, probably wouldn't be approved by FERC. Thanks.
Thanks, Carrie.
Next caller in the queue, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Can somebody confirm you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Robert.
Thanks, Ed. I just would like to kind of echo what Carrie was saying. We feel FRP is a very important implementation for the nodal aspect, and would not want to delay that in any way. I also agree that there's still a lot of information about what is being asked or proposed here that needs some investigation. For example, the discussion in regards to transfers ramping up prior to a sufficiency failure. This is contradictory to our observations. Either transfers can ramp up or generation can be increased for those time frames. So it's not always a one-to-one or something that happens consistently based upon our observations. So providing more information, providing additional details in regards to what these aspects are needed for, would be really important because, as I mentioned, this is not exactly what we have seen as well. I'd also like to mention, this keeps being mentioned as a reliability issue in regards to transfer supporting exports. The thing is, the HASS market is so far out on the horizon. Renewables that have cloud cover later in the day can support exports. Economics can support those exports. All these things can change from those timeframes, and this keeps being referenced to not support these exports when there are conditions that are just as critical that are supporting exports that continue to be real system conditions that are not just transfer supporting exports. So I think there's some definitely discussion that needs to happen, more discussion that needs to happen, would support kind of separating this aspect.
Thanks, Robert. I'm not saying that is what would happen every time. There are a number of different market results that could occur if the multi-interval optimization saw a BAA fail. The fact that that's a potential outcome, I think, is what we're trying to highlight.
Yeah, it's a potential outcome, but there's also multiple outcomes. So I don't see why making this kind of policy update based upon one potential outcome is necessarily important.
Okay. I think to the extent that, like, if you can kind of detail that in your comments, that would be appreciated.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
We do have one more caller in the queue. Next caller in the queue, your line is now muted. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Josh Arnold, PG&E again. I think I saw the horse twitch, so I figured I'd jump back in. Yeah, in response to Carrie, I do recognize that the stakeholder draft tariff language was never submitted to FERC, and that's because the initiative got pushed back to 2022 because of staffing issues at the CAISO. That's perfectly fine. I think my biggest concern is we are so close to implementation. We've done all this work. There is obvious benefit to FRP. I'm just really concerned that this late change is going to derail that, or we're going to get some kind of unintended consequences because we haven't given this enough thought and consideration. I don't know if this could be rolled into like a broader RSC initiative where the whole package could be considered more effectively. I don't know. I'm just very nervous about meeting our target for fall delivery for FlexRamp with this last minute change in place. That's what I'm just going to put out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Robert, did you have any follow-up questions, or is your hand still up? Oh, okay. I see that Robert put his hand down. All right, well, if there are no additional questions, I will turn it back over to Ellie to go through the next couple slides. Thank you, everybody, for your time and participation in today's workshop.
Thank you, Danny. Next slide, please. Before we close today's meeting, the ISO is pleased to announce this year's Stakeholder Symposium, which will be held in person at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. Registration for the event will open later this month, and a public notice will be issued once the site is available. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at symposiumred@caiso.com. Thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. We look forward to receiving your comments and have a great rest of your day. Operator, you may now conclude the call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.